In 1981, John Paul II had been Pope for less than 3 years. Then, on a warm May evening, he nearly lost his life when he was shot at close range during his weekly audience in Rome. The papacy that is now likely to be crowned with John Paul becoming a saint almost never got a chance to get started.
The Holy Father was very close to death. He was borderline between life and death.
The identity of the gunman was never in any doubt. Mehmet Ali Agca was an erratic 23-year-old Turk with a record of political assassination. He was caught on the spot before he could escape and eventually sentenced to life imprisonment.
I am Jesus Christ.
He's either the greatest pathological liar of the 20th century, or he was a master of disguising who really he is.
I have been trained by special experts on international terrorism.
Was Agca really an international terrorist, or simply a madman? Was he part of a massive conspiracy, or did he act alone? Was there an accomplice in St. Peter's Square in that fateful hour leading up to the shooting? If so, who? And was the gunman acting out a plot hatched by the Soviet Union and its client, Bulgaria?
Everything we'd learned about the Soviet Union since makes it entirely credible that men in Moscow would have been attempting to carry out this conspiracy.
It's just after 4:15 on a balmy Wednesday afternoon in Rome. Inside the Vatican, Pope John Paul is readying himself for his weekly audience with pilgrims and holidaymakers. In St. Peter's Square, the crowd is beginning to congregate in anticipation of the Pope's arrival in about 45 minutes' time. In the crowd, a man who has not come to be blessed or to take photographs, but who has murder on his mind. So who is this Turkish would-be assassin?
He told me he had taken on a sort of divine mission, and actually I feel that he did have a divine mission.
Ali Agca was an A-class criminal, a shifty character capable of saying one thing today and the opposite tomorrow.
With just a few minutes to go before the Pope makes his entry into the square, there's nothing so far to distinguish this audience from any other conducted by John Paul. But one 20-year-old American in the square today has a premonition that something is not quite right.
A couple of days before the trip, I woke up and I said to my husband, I said, terrorists are going to get me. And he laughed at me. And I just had the strangest feeling before I left that something was going to happen.
Another American tourist, Anne Audrey, a 58-year-old widow from upstate New York, is with a church-organized tour of Europe. Months later, back home in Buffalo, she was to record the events of this day in her diary.
May 13th, 1981, morning. Took a taxi to the Vatican from the Hotel Residence to attend a private mass, then toured the Vatican to where St. Peter was interred. After lunch, decided to return again with the group to the Vatican Square for a viewing of the Pope.
She had always wanted to visit the Holy Father and see him personally because he was of Polish descent. And ever since he was elected in 1978, that was her dream. So when this trip became available, even though she had no real close friend to go with, she decided that the Christian family was enough for her, to accompany her.
There were 42 people on our tour from every corner of the United States. Returned to the square at 4:45 p.m. The group had reserved sections. As this was my first visit, I was very excited and wanted to see the Holy Father.
She often said that when they were in St. Peter's, they had given a rose to the Black St. Peter, and legend has it if you touch his toe, it's supposed to be good luck. And she said she did because she wanted to have a safe trip home.
Behind the high walls of Vatican City, Pope John Paul has left his private apartment and is on his way to the papal jeep, which will then carry him through the crowds in St. Peter's Square. After proceeding round the square twice, as is his usual routine, he intends then to dismount and formally bless the pilgrims. But today there will be no formal blessing, because in 22 minutes, God has other plans for him. Meanwhile, according to one of the gunman's later confessions, in the Via della Conciliazione, a few hundred meters from St. Peter's, next to the Canadian embassy to the Vatican, this Alfa Romeo is to be his getaway vehicle. If true, the existence of the car, and more particularly its driver, is dynamite, since it represents proof positive that Mehmet Ali Agca is at the tip of a conspiracy reaching back almost certainly to the Kremlin. But did the car ever exist? Or was it just part of the many lies invented by the gunman later? At the Bulgarian embassy in Rome, 7 kilometers away, this truck, allegedly containing furniture, really does exist. It has been sealed earlier in front of Italian customs officers and is scheduled to leave later in the day for Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. Under an international agreement, trucks like this don't get examined at international borders. In one of his later confessions, Mehmet Ali Agca says it was this truck that was to be used to smuggle him out of Italy. As he mounts his Pope-mobile under the Arco della Campagna at the entrance to St. Peter's Square, John Paul knows that today is the 64th anniversary of a miracle. On May the 13th, 1917, the Virgin Mary is said to have revealed 3 secrets to 3 young Portuguese peasant children at Fatima. When he became Pope, John Paul found out the one remaining secret, and it's devastating. The Virgin told the children at Fatima that one day a bishop dressed in white would suffer greatly. John Paul does not know that he is to be that bishop. And indeed that the moment of the assassination attempt the Virgin foretold is just 17 minutes away. Mehmet Ali Agca doesn't know about the Fatima miracle, but he does know a thing or two about assassination, for this is a man with form. This is the funeral, 2 years previously, of Turkey's highest profile assassination victim of the time, newspaper editor Abdi İpekçi. The weapon that killed him? A 9mm Browning pistol, just like the gun Agca is carrying in Rome. And İpekçi's assassin? None other than 21-year-old student, Mehmet Ali Agca.
The murder of Abdi İpekçi was one of the greatest shocks of the 20th century in Turkish society, because İpekçi was a highly respected journalist, and till that time, terror that had been raging in Turkey had not reached up to a target as high as Mr. İpekçi.
During Agca's formative years in the late 1970s, Turkey had become a battleground between leftist and rightist groups. Murder, terrorism, and battles in the street were commonplace. Agca's hometown of Malatya in eastern Turkey was a center for the right-wing group called the Grey Wolves.
Grey Wolves were mostly young people recruited in small towns or cities of Anatolia to fight communism. In the 1970s, Turkey was deeply polarized between the left and the right. And the factions called each other, fascists and communists. And the Grey Wolves were the warriors of the right wing. They were well organized, they were well armed, and they had this ideological strength that made them more influential.
Four months after İpekçi's assassination, a notorious Grey Wolf hangout near Istanbul University was raided by Turkish police.
Ekonomik halleri Türkiye'de çok güzel olacak.
Mehmet Ali Agca sen misin? Ayağa kalk. İpekçi cinayetinden dolayı tutukluyor.
They'd got their man. But was Agca an anti-communist Grey Wolf? Or, as conspiracy theorists were later to believe, a carefully disguised pro-communist Bulgarian stooge, put in place to give him cover for more significant acts of murder later on the world stage?
After the assassination of Abdi İpekçi, Aja was put through an elaborate procedure to try to make him look like a gray wolf. But Aja was not a gray wolf. There's a great deal of evidence that Aja was dressed in gray wolf clothing rather deliberately.
To those who really knew Aja's political affiliations, this conspiracy theory is a fantasy. One such is Aja's lawyer, who worked on the İpekçi case for free, and who was himself a Nationalist Party member.
Mehmet Ali Aja was a member of the extreme right-wing nationalist group known as the Grey Wolves in Istanbul. I used to know all of them through various criminal cases I worked on.
After his arrest, Aja immediately confessed to İpekçi's murder with the words, "I shot Abdi İpekçi." But in a pattern that became established behavior for him, he was later to withdraw his confession. As the moment for his trial drew nearer, Aja threatened to reveal the identity of his masters behind the İpekçi murder plot. In effect, he was blackmailing his Grey Wolf comrades. Get me out of prison, or else. Within days, he was to walk out of Turkey's highest security military prison disguised as a soldier and accompanied by an officer. For his guards had been infiltrated by the Grey Wolves and the fascist nationalists. Having passed through 8 checkpoints, Aja and his confederate made their way across Istanbul's Bosphorus Bridge to a safe house, where he was to meet up with old friends from his hometown of Malatya, including his closest boyhood buddy, Oral Çelik. He was now Turkey's most wanted criminal. But bizarrely, the following day he wrote a letter to the self-same newspaper whose editor he only recently had murdered. It was an act of bravado, prompted by Pope John Paul II's controversial decision to visit predominantly Muslim Turkey in late 1979. Some Turkish Islamists and nationalists, Aja among them, were outraged.
The Milliyet newspaper, fearing that Turkey will form a political, economic and military alliance with our brothers in the Muslim world, Western imperialists have hurriedly dispatched their Crusader Commander-in-Chief Jean-Paul to Turkey. Unless this ill-timed and pointless visit is cancelled, I will definitely shoot the Pope. This is the only reason I have escaped from prison. Mehmet Ali Aja.
Aja's proclamations always sound very schizophrenic. He puts together concepts that do not necessarily belong together. Whether he does those things to hide his real origins and real identity, or just because he's sick in the mind, I have never been able to figure out, and neither have Turkish psychiatrists.
Now, 18 months later, Aja's public threat to kill John Paul II is about to be realized. But the question that remains to this day is whether he is, as he is first to reveal to his captors within hours of his arrest, a lone gunman, a self-styled international terrorist, a man with a personal mission and no accomplice. Or are there much more sinister forces behind him? In a series of confessions starting nearly 18 months after his attempt to kill the Pope, Aja produced 3 wildly different stories, with 3 wildly differing implications. In one, he said he'd been accompanied in the square that day by Bulgarian diplomat Todor Ayvazov. In another confession, his accomplice was Turkish left-winger Sedat Kirikadin. And in yet another version, he said he'd been accompanied that afternoon by his dear friend Oral Çelik, the Grey Wolf, who'd aided his escape from a Turkish prison.
Tutto quello che lui dice non è credibile.
None of what Aja says is believable. Whatever he says must be verified and checked, which, as you can imagine, is a problem for an investigating magistrate who, from the outset, is faced with a huge problem with grave consequences that makes his job of finding the truth very difficult indeed.
When he began his investigations, one of Judge Martella's earliest discoveries was that shortly after Adja's escape from prison in Turkey, he'd spent 2 months living it up in a series of luxury hotels in Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. To Martella, this indicated that the Bulgarians probably were involved in the papal plot.
Una persona come Adja, che era ricercato...
Someone like Adja, a murderer wanted by the police in more than one country, goes to a country like Bulgaria, at that time under a non-democratic regime which checked everyone entering or leaving the country, and spends almost 2 months there. Well, someone like Adja must have enjoyed some kind of protection.
But if Adja enjoyed protection in Bulgaria, there is a simple explanation that has nothing to do with the plot to kill the Pope. Sofia was at the time a major transit point for the lucrative Turkish mafia activity of smuggling drugs and guns, and Adja had impeccable connections when it came to the Turkish mafia. In July 1980, in the luxury Vitosha Hotel in Sofia, Adja met another Turk, Omar Mersan.
Evet, ben Metin.
Mersan was later to be described by the Italian prosecutors as a swindler well placed with the Bulgarian authorities. Mersan says that Adja introduced himself as a student called Metin, working for Turkish mafia godfather Abuza Ugurlu.
Söyleyin, işiniz ne buralarda?
Güllü Bey'den 2000 marka bana vereceksiniz.
Olabilir ama araştırmam lazım bunu.
Buyurun canım.
Sağ ol.
Adja's patron, Abuza Ugurlu, was one of the most important bosses of the Turkish mafia. In 1974, he'd been convicted of running 27 million cartridges and 70,000 guns into Turkey via Bulgaria. He was also wanted by Interpol for smuggling large quantities of cannabis between Syria and Western Europe.
Sadece 2000, tamam. Kendisi tamam o zaman. Evet. Tamam, parayı veririm ona. Sağ olun. İyi günler. Tamam dedi. Uğurlu Bey, parayı alabilirsiniz.
Çok güzel.
Sofya'daki otellerde çeşitli kanun...
Various criminals stayed in hotels in Sofia. Major arms and drug smugglers, members of the Bulgarian intelligence services and the mafia frequented these places, and they went out of their way to help the criminals because of the vast fortunes that were being made.
Yardım görüyordu arada büyük paralar döndüğü için.
Adja was undoubtedly in Sofia. He stayed at Sofia hotels, and that's in the registration records of the hotels. So there's no doubt that Adja did spend several weeks in Bulgaria, and he was probably able to stay in Bulgaria because he had protection from the Turkish mafia who were connected with the Bulgarian secret police. I don't think out of any part of the plot to kill the Pope, they were connected just out of small-time smuggling business.
Çok güzel.
Everyone agrees that Mr. Ugurlu instructed Mersan to give Adja 2,000 Deutschmarks, equivalent then to less than £500. To the conspiracy theorists, this wasn't mafia business, but a down payment by Adja's communist paymasters for shooting the Pope. Since to them it was entirely credible the KGB wanted to get rid of John Paul because of his anti-communist views and influence.
The Soviets were concerned about the Pope from the moment he was elected. It was a shock. And here, at the beginning of the 80s, when the Soviet Union still seemed to be flourishing, came a Polish Pope. What a hellish situation.
Under interrogation by Judge Martella, Adja wove a story of an elaborate plot involving the Turkish mafia, Bulgarian secret agents, and his old Grey Wolf comrades. In one of his contradictory confessions, a meeting in his hotel room in Sofia took on great significance. It was here, he said, that he first met Bulgarian secret agent Todor Ivazov, together with Turkish mafia boss Bekir Çelik and his Grey Wolf friend Oral Çelik. According to this version of his confession, this then was the first key planning session for the papal plot. 10 months later, according to the most likely of Adja's many scenarios, Çelik and he wait to carry out the final act of the plot that was possibly first hatched at the Vitosha Hotel in Sofia. Pope John Paul is near the end of his first circuit of the square and is right next to Adja and Celik. Will they, or won't they, shoot him now? Unaware of the gunman opposite, for Rose Hall and her mother, it's the perfect moment.
My mom was just so ecstatic. I was just taking pictures. I mean, I was snapping. I don't know if I got heads, if I got hands, if I got arms. I don't know what I got. I was just snapping happy. And everybody around us was trying to fight for just a touch of his cloth or whatever.
For Adja, the moment passes. He has no clear line of sight, and John Paul has escaped, albeit temporarily. John Paul II is in mortal danger. In 7 minutes, a renegade Turkish assassin with friends in strange places is going to shoot him. Is the gunman simply mad? Or is he carrying out an Islamic-inspired plot? Or is he a hitman for Bulgarian intelligence and an instrument of Russia's feared KGB? This man was also a key plotter, according to one of the gunman's many confessions. Musa Çeder Çelebi, a Turkish nationalist based in Frankfurt and leader of the right-wing Federation of Turkish Idealists Abroad. In reality, this innocent-sounding group was the foreign branch of Turkey's terrorist Grey Wolves. Adja claimed that it was during a meeting at a hotel in Switzerland in 1981 with Çelebi that Turkish mafia man Bekir Çelik outlined the final plans of the plot to kill the Pope.
Onu öldürmenin en kolay yolu bu çarşamba olacak. Niye bu çarşamba olacak biliyor musun? Çünkü çarşambaları onun etrafında hiç muhafız olmaz. Hem de halk içine çıkar nutuktan sonra. Siz de bu kargaşalıktan faydalanıp onun yanına yaklaşabilirsiniz. Korkma yani, Bulgar arkadaşlar bize yardım edecekler. Hem de bize 3 milyon mark verecekler. 1 milyon adam başı. 1 milyon sana.
One of the key aspects of evidence relating to Adja was the money that somehow mysteriously kept going into his bank accounts in Turkey. This was a young man of very modest origin from a very provincial city in Turkey who somehow started, when he was a university student, benefiting from large amounts of money which went into bank accounts that had been opened for him all over the country.
Musa Çelebi admits he did meet Adja in Milan and Zurich, but says that he only ever knew Adja as Murat, a Turkish student who was always pestering his organization for money. Çelebi says that far from being offered millions of Deutschmarks from the Bulgarians by Çelik, the most money Adja ever got was 800 Deutschmarks, handed over at the Zurich Sheraton.
Burada 800 mark var. Güle güle kullan. Tamam mı? Kimse de bilmesin hadi.
İyi oldu abi.
İyi oldu değil mi?
My mother saw throngs of people. She tried to stay pretty much with who was on the tour with her, and she related to me that just as the Pope was passing by, someone stood up in front of her to take a picture, and he went by, and she was very disappointed that she just didn't make any eye contact or see him really close. So she decided on the second pass of His Holiness that she just needed a better place to view him.
Someone else has not had a clear view of the Pope on his first circuit. But even though Mehmet Ali Adja could not get his shot in, according to most of his versions, the whole operation had been meticulously planned down to the last detail. By Adja's account, this had necessitated frequent interaction with his Bulgarian controllers, even by open telephone lines on some occasions.
Da, moля.
Is that the Bulgarian embassy?
Yes, how can I help you?
I need to speak to Sotir Petrov.
Just a moment. I'll put you through. Ало, майор Василев, тук някой на телефона пита за вас.
Да, питат за Сотир Петров. Да. Дали това ви е кодовото име?
Да говоря с него.
If Adja's confessions are to be believed, one must accept that a Bulgarian secret agent would have given the gunman the phone number of an open telephone line at the embassy as a means of contact.
Okay.
Since all the diplomats in the embassy except the ambassador took turns at manning the switchboard, that had to mean that everyone would know the agent's secret code name.
Yes, everything is good.
Ти трябва да застанеш на точната позиция, за да го удариш отблизо.
Of course. You must show me where to stand on the piazza.
Then there's the question of what language these conspirators spoke. Vasilev and his diplomat colleague Ivazov were later to swear that they spoke no English or Turkish, while Adja spoke only Turkish and rudimentary English.
Not to succeed. Okay, we'll talk soon then.
Разбира се. Чао, чао.
Bye.
One of the most compelling pieces of evidence Adja came up with confirming the Bulgarian connection concerns a meeting in the apartment of Sergei Antonov, the deputy director of the Bulgarian State Airline office in Rome. Adja claims it took place a day or two before the assassination attempt, and it was, according to him, a crucial planning session involving his Turkish co-conspirators and their Bulgarian controllers. It took Adja more than 17 months after the shooting, and half a year after agreeing to fully cooperate with the investigation, headed by Italian judge Ilario Martella, even to mention the existence of his host at the meeting, Sergei Antonov. At that time, he described Antonov, codenamed Bayramik, as having a blondish beard. He also provided many other details about Antonov, or Bayramik.
He told me that Antonov was a collector of miniature bottles. When we checked this out, it turned out that sure enough, Antonov had miniature bottles in his house. And we also found the shop where he bought them. This convinced me that Adja might have been to Antonov's apartment on a couple of occasions.
Si sia potuto in una o due volte recare nella casa di Antonov.
In another interrogation session with Martella, Adja provided further evidence that he seemed to know Sergei Antonov. He picked out a photograph of Antonov from an album he was shown of a number of Rome-based Bulgarians. There was only one problem. The picture revealed a man with a black beard, but to Mehmet Ali Adja, this was not an issue. He simply changed his previous description of Antonov's beard from blonde to black. However, there was still to be a further problem. Many witnesses were able to testify that at the time of the assassination attempt, Antonov had no beard. Adja also gave Judge Martella a convincing, detailed description of the apartment, including specific reference to a set of folding doors. The trouble is that the only apartment in the building that doesn't have these doors was Antonov's. Sometime earlier, they'd been removed and replaced by curtains. Adja also claimed that Antonov's wife, Rositsa, and daughter Anna were both at the meeting. He got their names right, but then it emerged that they had alibis for the time of the meeting. In fact, they weren't even in Italy. Once Anna and Rositsa's alibis were published in the press, Adja then told Judge Martella that he'd never met Antonov's family, had never been to the apartment, that the meeting had never happened, and that he did not even know that Antonov, whom he'd always known by the codename of Bayramik, was an employee of Bulgaria's state airline. But Adja was irrepressible. During one interrogation, he told Judge Martella that Sergei Antonov had first been introduced to him only the day before the assassination attempt, as the man who would drive him to St. Peter's Square. Then, at another interrogation, he suddenly remembered that he'd met Antonov on 2 or 3 previous occasions, the first of which was at the bar of the Hotel Torino in Rome. Then in yet another session with Martella, the story changed again. This time, he had first met Antonov here, at the Hotel Archimede in Rome, way back in December 1980, nearly 6 months before the attack on the Pope. This time they're supposed to have also discussed killing another thorn in Moscow's side, Polish trade union leader Lech Wałęsa. When Martella made it clear he didn't believe Adja, even though the Turk could provide intricate and accurate details of Wałęsa's hotel accommodation in Rome, Adja's response was simply to withdraw the accusations. Not to be stopped, 8 days later, Adja gave yet another version of the papal plot.
Adja, I want you to meet my good friend Bayramik. Bayramik, this is Adja. He's gonna be working with you on the file.
Now, according to him, he'd first been introduced to Antonov by his Bulgarian control officer, Major Zelio Vasilev, in Vasilev's Rome apartment.
About the money?
Again, Adja was able to provide his interrogators with many details on all his Bulgarian controllers. Their teeth, the fact that one had a pocket calculator, a rarity at the time, the car one of them drove. But he also made mistakes. In his account, Adja said that Vasilev was taller than Ivazov.
Everything is gonna be done.
Well, maybe not. Adja also told the Italians that Antonov's code name was Bayramik, that the Bulgarians should have chosen as his code name the name of a village near Adja's Turkish birthplace never seems to have struck anyone as odd, or suggested the possibility that the whole elaborate plot was simply a figment of Adja's imagination. But with all the inconsistencies, some months into his interrogation of Adja, Judge Martella decided to set him a test.
Adja parla di Bayrami.
Adja told us about Bayramich, who was Antonov, Petrov, who was Vasilev, and Ivazov, who was Kolev. Well, I had the photo album of all the Bulgarians who were in Rome at the time and were being investigated by some of my colleagues, some 42 pictures in all.
Stavano facendo delle indagini. Va bene? Allora io ho preso questo
So I took this album and I showed the pictures to Adja without him being able to see their names. Now he pointed at 3 of the photos, 1, 2, 3. And he named 3 people. That's Antonov, Ivazov, and Vasilev.
Adja had been able to match the names of the Bulgarians he'd previously implicated with their photographs. To Martella and the conspiracy theorists, this indicated he almost certainly had met them. But it would seem that Adja's task of identification was made easy for him. The pictures of Antonov and Ivazov were the first 2 images in the album. While Vasilev was the only character in the book in military uniform. All of which raises the question whether these were genuine identifications or whether Adja had been coached in some way by people who wanted to see the Bulgarians implicated. This would explain how he got some things right and many wrong.
The question that's never been answered is whether Adja was ever given any promise or commitment that if he somehow fingered the Bulgarians, he would be let out of prison. So we don't know the extent to which Adja was telling the investigators what he thought they wanted to know. There's also a possibility that he was deliberately misleading the investigators. He had read articles speculating about the Bulgarian connection, including some of the work of Claire Sterling, in the Italian press. So he may have been simply trying to mislead the investigators. He may have been having a sort of amusing himself with them, as he'd amused himself and misled the investigators in Turkey a few years before. It was exactly the same strategy. He would change his story every day and feed them new details, some of the details of which he'd learned during the course of the investigation. He did that in Turkey, and he repeated the same thing in Italy.
My mom was of Polish extraction, and the Holy Father and her mother were born in the same village of Wadowice, Poland. And so she felt this kind of connection with him.
When he came around the second time, it was not to shake hands with any of our group, it was to shake hands with the outer court, the people that were on the outer court. And there was many more people there. And it took a while, because, you know, he wanted to pray over people, he wanted to see people.
My mom was standing on the chair. The Holy Father approached. She was extremely happy that this time she was able to see him in full view. And at that moment, there was loud noise.
I cannot remember the shots exactly. I cannot remember hearing it. But all of a sudden, my mom thought I fainted because I saw the Pope getting shot. And I thought, no, I think I got shot.
My mom said she saw the Holy Father slump, and then she said I had a burning sensation in my chest. And before I knew it, I was off the chair and on the ground.
Adja's bullets have also hit his intended target. John Paul II has been wounded in 3 places. His life hangs in the balance. Had one of the bullets been just millimeters to the left or right, his aorta would have been punctured and he would have died almost instantly. Within seconds of the shooting, Sister Letizia, a Franciscan nun standing next to Adja, prevents him from making his getaway. While the Pope is rushed off to hospital and Adja is taken into custody, Anne Audrey and Rose Hall lie on the ground where they've fallen.
My first reaction was, where's my camera? What happened to my pictures? And all I could feel was a burning sensation in my arm. I've never felt pain like that before. And then it just started. Then the Swiss guards came running and they were taking care of the Pope, but they also was able to take care of us too. There was a number of them that was able to take care of us. And they didn't realize where I had gotten shot. So the best thing that they could do was to get us over that fence. They grabbed my arms. And the pain, then they finally realized where I had gotten shot, and they tried to grab me from my body up.
The bullet entered Mom's left breast, and it penetrated her upper intestine, damaged part of her lungs. She lost part of her liver. Also, she damaged part of her pancreas, and they had to remove her spleen at that time. And it ended up in her lower abdominal cavity.
After 9 weeks in hospital in Rome and the United States, Anne Audrey recovered from her injuries, but she was to be plagued with health problems for the rest of her life.
Il Santo Padre fu molto vicino alla morte e direi che quella
The Holy Father was very close to death.
guidata nel suo percorso.
I'd say that the bullet was miraculously guided in its path through the abdomen and its exit through the sacrum because it didn't damage the important arteries of the abdomen, like the abdominal aorta or the nervous system.
Questa pallottola
Thus, it seemed as if the bullet had been guided from on high, without causing internal lesions, which wouldn't have made it possible for the Pope to reach the hospital in time.
tempo materiale per poter essere portato in ospedale.
In St. Peter's Square there is chaos and confusion. But one tourist with his wits about him sees something very odd indeed.
Damn, I'm out!
American journalist Lowell Newton says that seconds after the shooting, this man ran past him, brandishing a gun, and that he captured him on film, using the last 2 pictures in his camera. When Adja was eventually asked who the man was, he identified him as the Bulgarian diplomat Todor Ivazov. However, when confronted with the fact that Ivazov looked nothing like the man in the picture, he changed his story twice. While the identity of the second man has never been completely confirmed, the most likely answer is that it was Adja's old grey wolf friend from his hometown in Turkey, Oral Çelik. With Adja under arrest immediately after the shooting, and his ever-changing stories about every aspect of the plot, we shall never know whether this is what happened in the immediate aftermath.
Oh, go, they got Adja. It's just me now.
Did Çelik really ride with Sergei Antonov to the Bulgarian embassy? Can we really assume that he then hid in the sealed TIR truck before being driven to Bulgaria? Certainly Çelik disappeared for many years before surfacing in Turkey again. Certainly the truck that was loaded at the embassy embarked on its journey that evening from Rome to Bulgaria. And certainly, in the years that followed, Adja's many versions, together with the hazy known facts, provided conspiracy theorists, and those with an axe to grind, with fertile material for any number of possible plots. Between May 1985 and March 1986, what many felt would be the final chapter of the conspiracy plot to kill Pope John Paul was played out in a Rome courtroom. After more than 2 years of investigation and a 1,200-page report, Judge Ilario Martella recommended that Adja, 3 Bulgarians, and 4 other Turks be put on trial for conspiracy to murder. All denied the charges, and things did not go smoothly for the prosecutors. The only concrete evidence that there had ever been a Bulgarian conspiracy had come from the mouth and fertile imagination of the key accused, Mehmet Ali Adja, who did not help matters by announcing on day 1 of the trial that he was the Messiah.
I am Jesus Christ.
Cioè che non mi ero accorto di avere a che fare con un messia.
I didn't realize throughout my time with him that I was dealing with a Messiah. Otherwise, I would have felt the hand of God on me.
After a 10-month trial, all the Bulgarians and Turks were acquitted of conspiracy to murder the Pope due to insufficient evidence. So how did the notion that there had been a Bulgarian conspiracy that was based on such flimsy foundations become so firmly rooted? The answer lies almost certainly with Ronald Reagan and those he had gathered around him when he became President of the United States in 1981, just months before the assassination attempt on the Pope.
Reagan came in 1981 with a typical Cold War view, that the Soviet Union was essentially responsible for all trouble around the world, and every threat that the United States had to deal with on a global basis, they had to deal with it because of actions that were taken by the Soviet Union. And this was extended particularly into the area of international terrorism.
So when Paul Henze, another sympathetic journalist, started writing books and newspaper articles on the Bulgarian connection, this played straight into the prevailing mood of the times. Even today, Henze has an explanation as to why no independent evidence of a communist conspiracy has ever emerged.
This was probably the deadliest, most scurrilous thing the KGB was ever involved in. So obviously, very early, when the Soviet Union began to collapse, measures were taken, and measures were taken even before that, to dispose not only of any records that might have existed, but to dispose of any people who might have been knowledgeable.
In 1984, CIA Director William Casey and Deputy Director Robert Gates commissioned a secret report for the President on the Bulgarian connection. But they asked junior agents to write it, since senior analysts were totally skeptical of any communist link with Adja.
The CIA had very good evidence that the Bulgarians were not involved, and indeed that the Soviets were not involved. But there were also accusations out there, and they were coming from second-hand and third-hand sources, and they were working their way into CIA operational reporting, so that if the CIA wanted to leak information to a European audience or an international media audience, clearly there were some provocative reports that could be cited that could be used in black propaganda, which the CIA obviously engaged in on the papal plot. This was a deplorable time in terms of American intelligence, and I think it really, this is really a holy grail issue. Once you start politicizing intelligence of the CIA, you get to the situation we're involved in now in Iraq, where the CIA gave false intelligence to the president and to the Congress to justify a war. In many ways, all of this started in 1984 and 1985.
So if there was no KGB or Bulgarian conspiracy, what scenario of the assassination attempt fits the known facts? For sure, Adja was the gunman. Certainly it seems he had an accomplice in the square, and probably this was his old friend, Oral Çelik. Equally certainly, Adja was connected to Turkey's right-wing terrorist Grey Wolves, who had a strong nationalist, anti-Western ideology with Islamist fringes. Adja also had connections to known Turkish mafia bosses, who definitely gave him small sums of money. As for the Bulgarians, With the collapse of communism, we now know that elements of Bulgarian intelligence were privately up to their necks in criminal activities with Turkish crime lords, the same criminals for whom Adja was a lowly employee. Finally, the key to Adja and his plot was there for all to see from the very day he wrote to a Turkish newspaper, 18 months before the assassination attempt.
Fearing that Turkey will form a political, economic and military alliance with our brothers in the Muslim world, Western imperialists have hurriedly dispatched their Crusader Commander-in-Chief Jean-Paul to Turkey.
I think there's a coherent explanation that revolves largely around the personality of Adja himself, that this was a man who had a thirst for fame, recognition. He had an ideology. He emerged from right-wing circles in Turkey. He was alarmed at the direction the country was taking. He detested the westernization of Turkey. He first killed a newspaper editor that was a symbol of westernization within Turkey. He then found himself on a much larger stage in Western Europe, and then he sort of did exactly the same things he was doing in Turkey, but he was looking for a target within Western Europe. And from the perspective of someone like Adja, the Pope was an obvious target. In fact, Adja himself had threatened to kill the Pope on a previous occasion when the Pope visited Turkey. I think a Turkish Islamic explanation was extremely possible. I'm not saying that it was a larger conspiracy. It might just have been Adja and a couple of his friends, but to me that is the most logical explanation for the assassination attempt on the Pope.
We're so obsessed with the Soviet threat and the superpower competition that we missed what was going on behind the scenes of the superpower rivalry. To understand Adja and his motivation is to get closer to what the West is dealing with now with regard to Islamic fundamentalism.
On Pope John Paul's suggestion, Mehmet Ali Adja was pardoned in Italy in June 2000 and sent back to Turkey to serve out the rest of his sentence for the murder of newspaper editor Abdi İpekçi. In a sense, his life had turned full circle, from small-time right-wing assassin to player on the global stage, and back again. Late in his life, John Paul II again contemplated the circumstances of the 1981 assassination attempt. Although he had consistently said that he never believed in the Bulgarian conspiracy, he did say that he believed Mehmet Ali Adja was acting on behalf of others. But he never suggested who he might have had in mind, and all we know is that for his part, he believed his life was saved that fateful day in May by divine intervention. Curiously, Mehmet Ali Adja believes he was an instrument of the Lord. On the day we interviewed him, Adnan Adja had come straight from visiting his elder brother in prison, and he brought with him a message for the world from Mehmet Ali.
He says that all this was God's will, in accordance with the prediction of the third secret of Fatima. He says that his act was the third secret itself. Prophets have come and gone. Messiahs have come and gone. Messiahs are those people who bring good news. The Vatican must accept that Mehmet Ali Adja is a Messiah and the third secret of Fatima. It must do this for the good of humanity, the future, and in the name of world peace.